Welcome to the Sacred Acts podcast from the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Cleveland. I am Reverend Randy Partain.
And I am Dr. Alan Georgia.
And we're hopeful that this experience evolves into an opportunity to hear about a lot of different people's spiritual practices, maybe even some things that other folks would not recognize as spiritual practices. But we are starting off with a few episodes where you have gotten to ask us anything, and we have some great questions.
I'm very excited about the questions we have, and also, which I think is pretty clear from, the things that we do at UUCC. Speaking for myself, Randy, I really appreciate the chance of talking at people. So excited to have these questions and excited to invite all of us into a conversation about what's spiritually meaningful in our lives.
Yeah, and I think, maybe we don't always realize that we have questions until somebody else asks it. And so that some of these questions might be things that a lot of other folks are curious about as well. Some of them are lighthearted, and some of them are pretty deep questions. And because we are who we are, I think we're starting off with a very deep question.
Yes, this looks like a very, very deep one. This one's from Bob McKim, who has asked, why are we moral? Way back at Jesuit college, I attended as an agnostic, and I was more than once asked, if you don't believe in God, why are you moral? I quipped something about a conscience, but I think the answer goes way beyond that. So, Reverend Randy, what is your sense about your own moral decision-making, the way that you think of your life as informed by conscience or morality?
I think we need so many caveats before answering this question. I am going to be able to give you my answer, and I imagine, Alan, you'll be able to give a personal answer from your perspective, but I'm not sure that these are right answers, and this is not like going into neurobiology and figuring out the wiring that causes us to behave in the way that we behave, but we can provide an answer for this, and maybe everyone listening might reflect on this and come up with some of your own answers about your behavior. I do remember that when I was in more Christian circles, there were some people who challenged me about my beliefs with something like, if you don't believe in God, how do you keep from going out and murdering and raping and stealing from people? Because their impression was that their relationship with Jesus was the only thing that kept them from doing all of that stuff. And I used to think, I have a much higher opinion of you than you have of yourself, when people would say that. But for me, I guess my response to all of that was, I don't have a desire to cause harm. And the times that I do cause harm in some way, not that it's as profound as some people's causing of harm, but I cause harm as a human being. And it's usually because I'm feeling defensive about something. I feel some kind of sense of threat. And so I do something that hurts another person because I feel threatened. But usually my love for other human beings wins out. And I believe I'm a moral person because the connection that I have with other human beings matters to me. And we could ask why that is, I guess, but I'll stop and let you maybe weigh in with an initial answer to that, and we can chat a bit more.
So for me, one thing I want to do, and apologies to Bob McKim for tackling the context of your very good question, but I feel like the question about why we're moral, for me, is really wrapped up in some of the assumptions that go into that question that immediately go to like the extreme possible case. And like we're talking about like genocide or murder or these things that actually are not really complicated moral questions to me, because a question about genocide or murder is like the self-interest of everyone involved doesn't need to go into deep moral territory to say, we will agree that if you do this series of acts or worse, like you are doing something that is clearly wrong. I mean, like there's no way in which if you were the person being murdered, you don't need to talk through whether or not it's okay that that's happening to you.
Right.
And at a social level, I think we would all pretty much have a line of things. So to me, the moral questions about this are much more about the more granular, the more day to day parts of ourselves. And I really appreciate this question, um, because it invites us to think about what we mean about morality as well as what we think about how we live moral lives. And so to me, the thing I would say is that when I think about morality, sometimes I find it really helpful to think about those questions not as um, a question of the rights and wrongs and sort of like a checklist of the way in which this works or the way in which this doesn't work, and more in terms of like how we paint the experience of our lives with the habits and care of who we are as people. And to me, that's a moral question because morality and all those granular interactions is the sum total of who we are. And so instead of thinking about a superstructure, which I think is behind Bob's question about God said these are the right things to do, and so therefore we do those right things, a different approach is to sort of think through the style of life we would like to lead, the impact, the kind of painting of our our still life's pose in our own day to day, and then we live into that. And to me, that is a more coherent moral impulse, is because I would like the shape of my life to have these sort of dimensions and this coloring and this shading and these elements. And so if you don't believe in God, to me, you can still think in terms of the effect of your life, the regard of your life, the happiness and regard that you have.
Yes. So let me try out. Let me see if I can interpret what you're saying into a practical reality that a lot of people experience. Because maybe morality would be defined by how we treat other human beings in our day-to-day lives and not those extreme situations. We might think about someone in need, maybe someone who is on the street that seems to be asking for money to do whatever they need to do for their lives, but it's an easy thing for a lot of us, I think, to ignore that person, to put up our guard. We probably have something in us that says, don't get taken advantage of. You don't know what that person's going to do with your money. I mean, there's all kinds of self-talk that happens. There's this internal dialogue that goes on when someone asks us for a handout. And so the moral decision there might depend on how vulnerable we feel and how much we feel like we need to protect ourselves from this situation, and how willing we are to just be vulnerable and extend something of ourselves to this other human being in need.
Yes, I think that is a very good example of the kind of stylistics we could bring into our lives, which is, in the case of the example you're bringing up, is fostering the, I think of it like a sculpture. I think of it as like a great painting or something, to foster into the world an example of this kind of empathy, this kind of care for other that, is embodied and sort of in place. I guess maybe at the root of it for me is to realize that morality is really a flat idea if your sense of it is you against the divine judgment of yourself. Like that to me is a very non-dimensional way of thinking about morality, and to think about it in terms of the way that all of this interacts with the world and the people in it, and that you are sort of a presence in it, is also really important. But it also raises me to something, Randy, I'd love your thoughts about, which is the other reason that I really feel compelled about thinking about morality in sort of more human terms, is because I also appreciate the idea of, as an answer to this question, why we are moral, being wrapped up in teachers and exemplars that to me are really important when we think about a moral life. Because when I try to really get to the root of some of the ways that I try to be moral, often it's because I met this person or I know this person who was a certain way. And I was like, oh, I want to be that way. I want to be more in this way. And of course, speaking as an educator, of course, I love the idea that we learn how to live in the same way that you might learn how to play an instrument, or the same way you might learn how to be a good baker, that you learn with practice, you learn with, again, sort of teachers who are there sort of put that into you. So maybe that's sidestepping the why part of the why are we moral question, but I'm curious, Randy, what you feel about moral teachers and the way that those experiences forge who we are.
Well, yeah, I think that's why the Christian scriptures have been so influential, because there's this figure of Jesus in these, and whether you want to take it as a historic story or you want to take it as mythology, there's an example there of what a divine human being, this blending of human and divinity looks like. And that example, I think, has been really, really powerful in Western culture and in other spaces. And a lot of our scriptures, whether they are traditional scriptures or whether they are scriptures that we choose for ourselves, that are a part of our own personal library of holy books or holy stories, I think a lot of them are because the people in those stories are presenting something we might aspire to be ourselves. Maybe sometimes we give ourselves permission not to be as moral or not to be as holy, because we think that those people are so much more elevated beyond mere human capability. But for me, there's a part of me that says, if this is a human story, then this is also my story. And if this other human being is capable of behaving in this really connected way, this way that connects not only to other human beings, but to an inner wisdom, then I have that capability as a human being to connect to other human beings and to my own inner wisdom too. And so it's aspirational to see these stories of moral people.
I appreciate that because it's almost like a proof of concept dynamic, which maybe doesn't always work for people because sometimes people are extraordinary and don't come from your context, and there are all different ways that you can't sort of manage that. But when it comes to being generous, when it comes to being sort of a transformational person who is growing and learning, when you see enough of those experiences in your world, I do appreciate, from exactly what you said, the ability to know that, like, then it's possible. Like, then what I am experiencing can't be the sole end of that, is sort of the limitation on that side of it. And to me, those questions are, if somebody, as a theistic person, if I heard another theistic person telling somebody else they couldn't be moral because they didn't believe in God, that would be exactly sort of the level that I would sort of go to, is to say, but I can show you all of these extraordinary moral exemplars. And if you're a theistic person and you have some weird metaphysical grudge to somebody that they shouldn't be able to be moral because they don't believe in God, well, you're leaving so many of extraordinary examples on the table, because these lives are beautiful and they draw my attention to sort of different things. So this question to me is really wrapped up in the people that we know.
Yeah. And they're imperfect in so many of the stories too. I mean, there are Old Testament stories in the what we might call the Jewish scriptures. There are stories about people who are exalted leaders, people of God. These kinds of folks that seem beyond mortal ken, and yet they do some really unhealthy things sometimes. And thinking about the gospel stories, I didn't really think about it when I was growing up and reading stories about Jesus, but I mean, he yells at his disciples sometimes. And he's not always this centered, calm individual that is completely at peace with all of the individuals around him. He does some things that we might look at and say, ooh, is that really what human and divine blended looks like? And I think that helps us, maybe if we look at it in an honest way, it might help us to cut ourselves a little slack too, and say, wow, I can have inherent worthiness and still do some really out of line things sometimes.
I so appreciate that also, because this is certainly a thing, as somebody who really treasures the Christian scriptural tradition, and that is, when you're in Christian worlds, of course, you can meet some again, extraordinary exemplars, people who are just wonderful embodiments of this Christian vision. Of course, you meet tons of people who are like, oof, I have no interest in any of the values you have and any of the stuff that you're sort of up to. But one of the things that I will note then is that as a result, I tend to be very aware of like almost like the maturity dimension of this, because there are mature people who are ready to deal with the questions you're raising here, Randy, about, you know, the kind of more complex picture, and that you don't kick out a good example because there are these faulted parts of those people. And I raise all of that to bring it back to sort of UU circles, because I think we are in UU conversations, you know, wrestling with lots of pasts and taking seriously a lot of those questions. And I think real moral clarity to ask questions why we're moral, those questions are enriched when we take seriously those flaws and we acknowledge that, oh, this person over here, you know, said these really, really great things, but also they were also like a eugenicist in the early 1900s, and that's not necessarily a part that we appreciate. And I just note that, to me, wrestling with that, that's actually a rich, positive thing in terms of what we can learn from that, and a reason to engage deeper instead of turning away. So that's my little sense from my own experience wrestling with a complicated tradition.
Yeah, and as we were talking, I was thinking about Unitarian Universalist culture and values, and this idea that we are a part of an interdependent web of existence, and that every person has inherent worthiness. Those two concepts seem like cornerstones to me, and maybe the liberating love piece of that is making its way to the forefront of our conversation about what it means to be Unitarian Universalist is really getting at, how do I respond to that? You know, I can be aware that there is an inherent worthiness to every person at an intellectual level, and I can be aware that I am interdependent with all of existence at an intellectual level, but how do I respond to that? And if I respond to that in a way that gets back to Bob's question about morality, if I'm aware of those connections, and if I'm aware of that inherent worthiness, then love is the way that I respond as a moral entity. And that love might be for myself, that I recognize my own inherent worthiness and connection, and I look at other human beings and see within them that same quality, that inner divinity, that inherent worthiness, that whatever we want to call it, that I look at them and see the divine. And I look at myself and see the divine. And I say, how would God treat God? Mm. And when I say, how would God treat God? Then I get to be moral with other human beings and honor that interdependent connection that we all have with everybody else.
I think that's a fantastic way of making the divine part of this that's behind Bob's question, but in a different way. Like this, mm-hmm. That God is still there as a concept to talk about our worthiness. If you don't mind, a quick little note. I didn't want to include this in the more relevant part of the conversation, but as a little tag, I also did want to note, because this is a thing that is ringing in the back of my head, which is especially in certain popular atheist circles, there is a tendency to jump to very much like an innate built-in morality, that if you don't exhibit that, you're sort of missing the point. That I think might be like a response to somebody saying, if you don't believe in God, then why are you moral? Is to say, like, you know, you should know not to do those things, and if you don't know those things, then I think you're a psychopath, and you know, sort of that side of it. And in particular, there's a particular chorus from a comedian I enjoy, Bo Burnham, where the song is from God's perspective, and is a sort of jokey thing about God maybe not being as into us as we think that God would just be totally. And the chorus is about how there's like 10 billion aliens who are cooler than humans. Like maybe God isn't worried about us all that much. It's kind of like a joke. But anyway, one of the lines is, you know, you shouldn't abstain from rape just because you think I want you to. You shouldn't rape because rape is a very messed up thing to do.
Right.
And I only want to note that to say, I think it's important in a question like this to acknowledge that at no point in our morality do we start from a blank slate. And the pushback I would want to put to the sort of atheistic idea that there's some kind of like moral bedrock that we can kind of emerge into, and that consensus is sort of inevitable, is that I think we do have to be careful about the way that we think about our moral senses as something that we receive Maybe it's from a divine hand, but also maybe it's from just the accretion of ancestor wisdom that has built up over years, and to not be so quick to just assume that we would never lose track of these obvious things that we don't need to learn about, or we don't need to have cultivated in us, because you would just know that rape is horrible and you would never do that. So I always think about that when I hear that comedy song, and it makes me think of this with Bob. In my response to why we are moral is, what I wouldn't want to say is we are moral because we can't not be, and no guidance is necessary for me to become a moral person. So that's a little caveat I would want to also respond with.
So the short form of what you're saying, maybe, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that we learn how to be human from other humans.
Absolutely. And we can't take for granted that the things that we care about as human moral values are just, the thing that right people come to the understanding of, and that would never be otherwise. Small bit, but important to me.
Yeah, we could probably spend an entire season of a podcast on this question, but I know that our goal is that we're going to eventually get to having conversations with other folks, and maybe this even sparks some conversation around dinner tables or in some small groups, or maybe in some online conversations about morality and what it means to be a fully alive human being. But we did have a personal question that kind of helps to set up the overall purpose for this experiment that we have going on. And this is coming from Valerie, and she's wondering if we have had any transcendent religious or spiritual experiences that we would care to share.
That is such a gigantic question.
We start off with two big ones.
I know, no joke at all. These are I assume they were shared in such an inviting way, but immediately my mind is just like scattershot to all my, because you want to think of big, huge ones and also small little ones. So I definitely have had, I would say, transcendent experiences myself, both grand and very small. So they sort of touch all through experience. But in terms of thinking about one that is nice and shareable, one that would represent some of those things all together, I suppose what I would point to is a thing for me in my personal biography is I spent all these years in my late elementary into high school, or into sort of like through middle school, in an English style boys choir. And which I understand is a very unusual thing for a person in a Florida suburb to be doing. And I only realize now as an adult how impactful that experience was on me. And an important thing to note, if you don't know anything about boys choral music, is you can only do boys choral music until you're about 13 or 14. And then you can't do it anymore because you're no longer a boy singer. Now you're a male singer, a men's singer, whatever. There are, of course, the handful of rare cases of extraordinary like contralto singers who are older men who have maintained a soprano voicing, but that's not ordinary. So I say all of that to say, when you're in a boys choral situation, you are a professional in your musical area. You can't not be 12 and do this. So that you're sort of amped up, and that was very much that experience. And what I will say is that strangely was a really formative spiritual place for me, because even though it was a secular organization and we were not part of a church or anything of the sort, it was very much a community organization, and we did plenty of pop music and other kinds of things, but inevitably you sang a decent amount of sacred music as well. And so I didn't know this at the time, but it meant that for my personal experience, I was being tended in a really rare little garden of spiritual pristineness, I guess is the word that comes to mind, because weirdly the lack of having a church or any other institution involved meant that like it never got talked about, but I was just there reading the English translation of the Latin that we were singing, or the German, or it's Bach, or it's whatever it happens to be. But then also as a result of that, to be sort of without some pastor or teacher or religious official telling me that this is what it's supposed to be. It also meant that the musicality was wrapped up in what I was then reading and kind of like learning along the way, at times in ways that were really profound for a young person to sort of be in. And one of those, there's a medieval and sort of Renaissance era Latin text. So the Confitemini Domino is just like this choral sort of piece. And one Christmas season, the setting that we were doing was sort of a cappella. And we were in a very small church doing this concert, but it had like all marble floors. And it was an evening concert, and the entire thing was in candlelight. And for whatever reason, this is the thing I think any musician would experience of like everything just came together. It was just one of those evenings where everyone was just kind of like clicking and on. And the experience of, because I'm trying to catch the transcendent part of this, the experience of this possibly 500-year-old text being set to 300-year-old music that was being expressed by a bunch of 12-year-olds in a beautiful setting at night with candles. The experience of producing that music, seeing the faces of those receiving that music, the interconnectedness of all of those experiences and all of those things coming together. That was a moment of revelation, maybe is an overly charged word. It lifted the veil such that I couldn't pretend I didn't know there was a veil there anymore. It was one of those experiences that said, this, the experience that I have in the physical world day to day is not the only part of this, because you couldn't acknowledge and notice all the things that were happening in that brief musical pause of that song. I think it's like a 2-minute song. It's not very long, but in that time, that was one that really shaped my own vision. So that's the one that Valerie's the question leads me to. But I would just want to stress, I could think of many much larger, in terms of some extraordinary thing to see or some other small thing to do. Like there's so many answers to this question. So I want to stress for anyone listening, your experiences, I'm sure, are just as varied as mine. So that's just one I can share. How about you, Reverend Randy?
Well, I also have a deep connection to music. And what I find is that a lot of it matters. The space that I am in is what matters. The end of Stravinsky's Firebird can be a transcendent experience for me, but only if I am in the right space to receive it. And I've written some pieces of music that, I think about the experience of hearing my doctoral dissertation, which was an orchestral piece. Hearing that performed was a transcendent moment for me because it was the culmination of so much work, and it required me to surrender, I think, is what made it a transcendent moment. I had no control over what was happening, and yet there were other people that were committed to realizing a vision that I had set in motion with abandon. The performance was not cautious. And so this expression of of intense human commitment and this sense of surrender on my part just came together in a really meaningful way that I think we often don't experience. Surrender is really difficult for me, and I think for a lot of human beings, just being able to give ourselves over to the moment. But outside of music, there are a couple of juxtaposed moments that came to mind, and one of them was in a natural setting, out away from cars. I love all of the parks in the Cleveland area. There's a lot of beautiful green space. However, I can almost always hear traffic and other signs of civilization when I'm out in those spaces, as beautiful and immersive as they can be. But being up on a mountain with a great vista and there being nobody else around, and it just being this spread out natural landscape that I just breathe in for a timeless moment has been transcendent for me. And then the juxtaposed piece of that is I'm starting to realize that gathering around a game table is church for me. There are a lot of times where I am engaged in a worship service and I am fully present in a worship service. However, my role in that worship is such that I don't quite experience it the same way that other people hopefully experience it, because I'm doing a kind of a rarefied role. But there have been moments around a table playing a game with other human beings where that was the only thing that mattered in that moment. And it was completely removed from everything else that I might be anxious about or anything else that I might need to worry about in a few hours. And it was just this moment of human connection that, to me, I think fits within the realm of transcendent spiritual experience. And again, I think all of that, it really matters how I show up. If I bring a willingness to be fully present in those moments, I think there are a lot of, I think I miss a lot of opportunities for transcendence, I think is where I'm actually arriving at, is that when I bring myself to a willingness for some moment to be transcendent, there are a lot of moments that could be that I miss out on, you know?
I think that is a good, attentive drawing sort of approach that I certainly also can totally agree with. They go by me all the time, and when you catch yourself acknowledging, when you fall in for a moment, because I think that's one of the things transcendent experiences do. They attune you to the fact that they are there. So then occasionally you get a glimpse of one, even when it's not the full blown one. And this goes back to like Buddhist teaching and also like ancient Greek philosophy, like this idea that like the world then that you're in day to day with your Google Calendar and your all that other stuff, you realize it's like, this isn't the good stuff. The good stuff is something about that dandelion flower over there I just walked past that I just totally missed, just went right by me because I was rushing off to get to something else. Absolutely.
And we have a question coming up, and that I think is going to be a couple of episodes out, that is about our own spiritual practices, where we might be able to dig a little more deeply into
Absolutely.
this as we lead into conversations with some other folks about their opportunities for transcendent experiences. But maybe this seems like a good
Absolutely.
place to close out for the first episode.
What a rich area of questions we have already started with. Our garden already grows with beautiful greenery.
Well, and I hope that if you're listening, that you have enjoyed this initial dipping of the toes into this experiment, and I hope you're thinking about your own spiritual practices, because we are going to want to hear from a wide variety of people about the kinds of things that help you move into a space of transcendence. So that's coming up in a few episodes. We do have some really great questions that you all have posed, though, and so we'll do a few more episodes of the Ask Us Anything, and then we'll switch gears a little bit and let you all do a little more of the talking. But for now, we will say, create something beautiful today.
And thanks for listening.